All right, we'll start up. So I'm going to go ahead and start the class. But tonight's class is going to be on the charts of Queen Victoria and Benjamin Disraeli. We're looking at this as being a working relationship. But as I was preparing for class tonight, I became so fascinated by Victoria's chart that I wanted to discuss that a bit before moving on. Is there anything here that stands out for any of you? Well, and even before her crowning, her life was very 12th house. I mean, the unusual thing is that Victoria, who would have thunk that she would be queen? She was sixth in line to be queen. Her grandfather and her father, I believe, died a week apart from one another. Her uncles had left no heirs. And so she was next in the line of succession. However, would you like to know how she described her childhood? 2 words. Rather melancholy.
I'd say that sounds like 12th house.
Yes, it does. She was raised isolated in what was called the Kensington system, named after Kensington Palace, where she was raised. Her father, who I believe was the king's brother, died, and she was raised in isolation by her mother, the Duchess of Kent, and her mother's lover, Sir John Conroy. Throughout her life, or until she became queen, Victoria shared a bedroom with her mother.
And how old was she when she became queen?
June 20th, 1837. She was born in 1819, so it was age 18. She was taught by tutors. Conroy had an abusive temperament, and he and her mother would constantly badger Victoria to make him her secretary. She continued to refuse. Once she was crowned, Conroy was banned from her presence. He remained in her mother's household. Victoria was Queen of the UK, Great Britain and Ireland, from June 20th, 1837 until her death, January 22nd, 1901. From May 1st, 1876, she used the additional title Empress of India. 1837 to 1901. Her reign was 63 years and 7 months, longest of any female monarch in history, and is known as the Victorian era. This was an era of industrial, cultural, political, scientific, and military change within the United Kingdom that led to a great expansion of the empire. Victoria had 9 children with her first cousin, Prince Albert Saxe-Coburg. Their children, their 9 children, married into the aristocratic ruling families of Europe, earning her the nickname, the grandmother of Europe. Back to the 12th house. After Albert's death in 1861, so that would have made her 42, Victoria plunged into deep mourning and wore black for the remainder of her life. She avoided public appearances and rarely set foot in London, remaining secluded in her royal residences. Died 22nd of January 1901 at age 81. Prince Albert died of typhoid fever.
Such a devoted figure.
They were remarkably in love, this couple. Uranus, sesqui square Mercury, trine Venus, trine Mars. Yes, I would say he stimulated her. Sextile Jupiter, square Saturn, so that could be perceived as an early demise. Seventh house ruler squaring Saturn, a loss. Unexpected loss. Of course, it's conjunct Neptune and also squaring Pluto, since Pluto and Saturn are just 1 degree apart. Well, Prime Minister. I'm almost thinking that they're both rulers, in a sense, of government. Right, it's almost a seventh house relationship, except the Prime Minister is the head of the Parliament, the governing body, which is 11th house. So it's hard to say. They did maintain a friendship for the duration of his life. Let's go back to her rather melancholic life. Look at her 12th house, 26.5, but it's not discordant. Her house of friendships is discordant, which means it could mean a couple of things. On one hand, if you think about it, part of what's important about schooling is not just education. What else might it be, Barbara? What happens to children in the school environment? Thank you. They get socialized. What do you think happened with this girl with the incredibly discordant 11th house? She missed out on the socialization process. So that Saturn in the 11th house, there was never a training on how to have friendships. And that may have functioned as a great sorrow in her life. With that powerful, harmonious 12th house, methinks she was quite pleased to go into mourning and withdraw from society and go and live in Balmoral Castle, away from London and the masses, with Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown was her, a man who keeps my horses. The tip of all of your tongues. Yes, thank you. Yes, and they had a very devoted relationship to one another that led to suspicions of a romance, and so she was oftentimes in society called Mrs. Brown by her detractors. Believe me, it was the Victorian era, and she was taught by her mother. Her mother hated going to the palace or even taking Victoria there to expose her to her grandfather because of his vast numbers of illegitimate children, which she thought was morally reprehensible. And so a big part of the Victorian era was having straight-laced morals. And that was drummed into her by her mother. So it's hard to imagine if that really happened or not. I suppose it could happen to anyone.
Yeah, but being in the 12th house, there's a confinement that's associated with just about everything about
Right. And certainly Venus in the 12th house is clandestine romance or unrequited romance. There could be a love there that was just never acted upon. Well, here's someone else with Venus in the 12th house, and I know little to nothing about Disraeli's love life. Benjamin Disraeli was the only British Prime Minister of Jewish birth. All of his grandparents and great-grandparents were born in Italy of Sephardic Jewish background. He, however, converted to Anglican faith at age 12 before being bar mitzvahed. He entered the House of Commons in 1837 and became prime minister briefly in 1868. He was also prime minister from 1874 to 1880. As I mentioned earlier, in 1876, Queen Victoria was crowned Empress of India, a title believed to have been created by Disraeli. At the same time, she made Disraeli the Earl of Beaconsfield. So when he became an Earl in 1876, he automatically lost his seat in the Commons, but retained Prime Minister and was able to lead the government from the House of Lords. The Disraelis died without direct heirs, and their titles became extinct. He died 20 years before her in 1881, but up until his death, they did maintain a friendship. I mean, truly,
She stayed out of the limelight,
yes,
but it was still able to wield her power.
possibly. At least what's written doesn't indicate that. In fact, it was quite troubling to her nation that she was not visible and present. It was really quite troubling, but who knows? I mean, this is certainly before the day of telephone, but she may have had, some kind of means of. I mean, she was all the way up in Balmoral in Scotland, which is a decent distance from London. But, right, certainly Sun in the 12th house is the power behind the throne, except for the fact that she was the throne. She was the throne. Now, on the other hand, the chart we're not talking about tonight, which is Prince Albert, much like the current spouse of the Queen, his title was Prince Consort. And guess what that gets you? Not a whole lot other than sleeping with the Queen.
Yeah.
There are no duties or responsibilities associated with that. And so he was quite stymied in this life, married to the Queen of England, having their 9 children, and he had to figure out what sort of charitable causes and things he wanted to be involved in. And remarkably so, he was in the forefront of advancing education and fighting worldwide for the abolition of slavery. At birth, it would appear that she had a snowball's chance in hell of being the crown of England. But the way that life unfolded with unexpected deaths, she suddenly was in that position. Fortunately for her, her mother and John Conroy had prepared her for that. She was raised in such a way that she could be a successor and be prepared. And so all of that was done, in a sense, behind the scenes. But it was part of her life of imprisonment. first imposed by family, later self-imposed by her mourning, and imposed by wearing black her entire life. Let's take a peek. Dominant midheaven. Is anyone surprised? No. Her name is a household word. You could say Queen Victoria just about anywhere, and somebody would know who you're talking about. Dominant sun. Even though it's in the 12th house, look, it conjuncts the moon and the ascendant. This is a triple Gemini. Sun, moon, ascendant, all in Gemini. So we can see Gemini is the most powerful sign. Dominant Uranus. Uranus is angular, and we saw before that Uranus forms aspects to everything but the sun, moon, midheaven, and ascendant. How curious. I don't have her wedding date here. Well, she was married to him long enough to have 9 children. But I'm thinking they were married for 20 years. I was trying to think of how the dominant Uranus has left a hallmark on her personality.
Well, she ruled during the Industrial Revolution.
But in terms of her character, I mean, a lot of people lived during the industrial age that would not have had a dominant Uranus, though she was at the head of a country that was in constant change and advancing the empire. Though I'm thinking temperamentally, that dominant Uranus can oftentimes be authority oppositional. This was certainly apparent in her relationship with her mother and Sir John Conroy, who she was constantly fighting their externally imposed restrictions. What I find unusual is if we say somebody's Victorian, we oftentimes are describing them as being conformist in some ways, conforming to a very strict orthodox or conservative standard. So, there's something that question here for me in terms of how her dominant Uranus expressed.
Is that I know it aspect. What is it aspect?
Everything except the sun, moon, ascendant, and midheaven, which are the 4 points of key identity in one's chart.
What is for Venus and Mars?
They called India the jewel in the crown of the empire. So I would say she was certainly fed by the expansion of the empire. Now, sadly, expansion of empire usually comes at the expense of thousands of deaths, which she would have been removed from in her ivory castle. But the British occupation of India was a bloody affair. The Indians weren't as excited about having the British there as the British were about being there. So, dominant 12th, 11th, and 10th houses. Dominant Gemini, Aquarius, and Sagittarius. Air and fire. Let's look over here. Disraeli, dominant ascendant. He had a very striking, though not entirely attractive appearance. But he is someone that if you look at him, he stands out in some ways. And here we've got this conjunction with the ascendant of Venus, Jupiter, Neptune, and the ascendant all in Scorpio. Scorpio is his dominant sign, which makes me suspect that this was definitely the power behind the throne. He may have had to do a lot of backroom dealings, but he also has Leo and Libra powerful, which gives the combination of the fire and air. You know, he certainly lived before motion picture. But I'd say he would probably be an amazing person to see giving oration or opening sessions of the House, because I imagine he presented himself with such charisma. All of that personal charisma, personal magnetism. Leo, squares. And, you know, this is, you know, what I find interesting about his chart is the conversion at an early age. It's not entirely surprising, since Jews were not allowed to hold office in England. The Parliament actually had to come up with a change to their constitution, which they called the Jewish disability, so that Jews could be sworn into office not without the New Testament attached. But he, of course, avoided that. Now, it's hard to say. I've not seen any writing on the subject, whether Israeli was somebody who was, you know, true in his conversion to Anglican Christianity, or whether this was a convenience to be able to function in a dominant society. Either way, either being a Jew or a Christian would be troubling to him. Why? He's got the Moon and Mars conjunct in the 9th house. Religion would be a troubling affair. Let's look at the 9th house. It's reasonably discordant. So, but Mars does trine the Sun. 19 to 29, that's wide. But nevertheless, it's powerful. Sun in an angular house. Conjuncts. Sun conjuncts Mercury. Let's see. Mars trines the Sun, conjuncts the Moon. Sextile Saturn and Uranus. Let's look at their impact on one another. I do know he went abroad. I do not know that he spent much time abroad. So let's take a look here. This is Queen Victoria's chart with Disraeli's planets in the outer wheel. This is a work relationship. And you asked Vicky, how did he influence her? And if we actually look at the chart, you know, in a sense, he was to some degree a servant of the crown. He sought to have compatible relationships between Parliament and the monarchy. However, Libra and Scorpio tend to be a natural opposition to Aries and Taurus. His Sun was in her 8th house, which would be interesting to see, you know, if he, you know, voted any appropriations or, you know, advances or increased livelihood. He did push to have her crowned Empress of India, and I imagine there was some fiduciary benefit gained from that.
Well, in his chart, he had Mercury. It was a Mercury ruled second house and very discordant. There were probably some financial issues, I would think.
Okay, he has Saturn. She has what, 3 degrees Libra on the cusp, or 8 degrees Libra on the cusp of the 6th? Libra. He has Saturn at 15 Libra, Uranus at 20 Libra, Venus at 21 Scorpio, Jupiter at 25 Scorpio, Neptune at 26 Scorpio, and the Ascendant at 27 Scorpio.
So it's just because in her chart there's an intersection
Correct.
that they look that way.
She's born close to the summer at a very northern latitude.
Okay, then
There's almost 2 signs. If you look here, Laura, from 8 degrees Libra to 5 degrees Sagittarius,
in hers.
it is 57 degrees in one house alone.
I see.
So it's encompassing all of his planets that span 2 complete signs.
Right,
So that's, that's a lineup. His Pluto falls in her 11th house of friendships, and we know that he remained her friend, of which I imagine she had very few, through his entire life.
Pluto is a pretty intense friendship, right?
It is. It's a deep, deep connection. Now, if we look at his chart, her Uranus and Neptune are in his first house. Neptune's within 2 degrees of his sun. I mean, it's really 1 degree and 15 minutes apart, which I believe is close enough to be felt by him. And so I would think that he may have felt a very deep psychic connection or sympathetic relationship with Victoria. Her midheaven is in his 2nd house, so the fate of her career could influence his finances. Her Jupiter is in his 3rd house, so they would have benefited in their communications with one another. There would have been some benevolence there. We know they did not live together. Nevertheless, he has 3 planets in her 4th house, and who knows, he may have made suggestions where she should live. Venus and Mercury of his are in her 5th house, which means he may have felt some affection to her children or to her. Sun, moon, and ascendant. Her sun, moon, and ascendant all fall in his 7th house. And so, to some degrees, I would say when they worked together, she may have been like a spouse to him. There was a relationship. There was a type of partnership taking place. Curiously, there are not that many planets in aspect between their charts. Which leads me to believe that their relationship was based on this powerful 6th house connection of him to her being her servant, and for him, her being his partner. The predominance of Disraeli's planets fall in her sixth, which is service. And the predominance of her planets fall in his seventh, which is companionship. Also his fourth house. And, you know, she did have an impact on his home, because along with his becoming the Earl of Beaconsfield, there was a house that went with that. It came with an estate, so that certainly impacted where he lived. Right, they are off. 17 degrees Aries for Victoria and 19 degrees Leo. Nevertheless, as you say, it's smooth. They're in the same element. They're in complementary signs. Mars is the planet of initiative. They can work together. Again, there's also a trine between the business planets. Saturn, in his chart, is in 15 degrees of Libra. Jupiter, in her chart, is 16 degrees of Aquarius. There lies another trine of being able to do business with one another. There's a sextile between her 8 degrees of Taurus, Mercury, to his 8 degrees of Pisces, Pluto. The intellectual urges in an opportunity compound with the universal welfare urges.
His power, his relationship with her mom.
Except for the fact that Pluto's in the third house. I think the way this may have worked is he helped advance the empire. I don't think he did advance his own personal power because he had her crowned empress, she had him made earl. So, for a Jew to receive aristocratic title in England is a big deal. Why? Because they were pretty much kicked out of England in the 13th century. The Jews were expelled. And it was not again until the 15th, 16th century that they were able to slowly return. This was mostly the Sephardim who were leaving Spain at the time of the expulsion and in the century following. It was politically motivated, and mostly under Richard. It had to do with the Crusades and Richard the Lionhearted. Yeah, they as under the First Crusade, as they're heading out to the Holy Land, they're, thinking, why wait till we get to the Levant to kill people? There's plenty of Jews along the way. Let's massacre a few villages here and there. Her Saturn in Pisces squared his sun at 29 degrees Sagittarius. Not a great compliment. What happens to the sun person when it's in aspect with Saturn? Thank you. It's a wet blanket. The Saturn person throws a damper over them. Though she did advance his prestige. And what's the sun person, especially Sagittarius sun, to sad Saturn in Pisces? What was he probably trying to do? Buoy her up. Come back to London. Your people need you. You still have a lot to give. No, I think I'll just sit here in the dark and cry. But her Saturn, 28 Pisces, to his 27 Scorpio ascendant. That's a trine. Saturn in favorable aspects, creates long-term relationships. You don't abandon the other person when you have Saturn aspects between your charts. They may be a wet blanket, but they're your wet blanket. Saturn also forms an inconjunct to his moon. So again, there would have been some type of emotional security there. Her Pisces, Pluto, 27 degrees, trines his ascendant. So his personality would have been in a luck compound with her universal welfare urges. They would have been able to get things done together. His moon's an exact trine with her Neptune. He would have been able to feel her vision. And she would have been able to imagine him in a new house, a new grand house, moon in Leo. His moon in Leo formed a trine to her Venus. You know, I think there was genuine love in this friendship. They probably really liked and cared for each other. Also, her Pluto in Pisces formed a trine to his Neptune in his 12th house. So one does have to imagine with these two dominant 12th house individuals that there were meetings behind closed doors, that history does not have all the facts, that agreements probably would have been made between them. He was only prime minister twice.
Right.
Once for a few months,
Yeah.
and the other for 6 years. But the entirety, from the time he was the prime minister till his death, they remained friends. And of all of her prime ministers during that period of time, which I think there were, she reigned for 63 years. Yeah, she had something like 15 prime ministers during that period. She liked Disraeli.
Yeah.
I don't know if it was ever said the same of her other prime ministers. Well, let's look at his chart for 1876, when he became an earl. We'll pick the middle of the year, since I don't know the exact date. What would we be looking for receiving title or honor or an increase in status? 26 Cancer. It's leaving a trine with Jupiter and applying to a trine with natal Neptune, progressed Jupiter, and the ascendant. So let's look for Sun, midheaven, and Mercury aspects for him during. Let's filter these. We want to see Sun aspects, Mercury aspects. Progressed Mercury, conjunct Venus, ruler of the 10th house of titles, honor, recognition. We have Mercury, the ruler of the 10th house, trine, natal, and progressed Uranus. 19 Aquarius, 20 Libra. Again, this was an unusual thing, Uranus, for his being made the Earl of Beaconsfield. And the midheaven, ruling one's status, titles, reputation, was sextile his ascendant at that time. So, progress midheaven, 3 Sag to 3 Aquarius. And last but not least, the Sun, which represents honor and prestige, was sextile the co-ruler Mercury of the 10th house. So all of that was in orb at the time he received his title. Mercury was opposing Mars in the 9th house of publicity. What do you think his receiving a title did?
Brought up a stink.
It brought up a storm in the press. There were cartoons of him and Victoria exchanging crowns. Her getting the Empress crown and his getting the ducal tiara. All right, let's see.
And she found it very entertaining, and she loved that about the way he communicated.
Right, and he went on, I think, to write 3 novels. And the same thing. He was writing about what was going on in the world, but putting it in a storytelling version.
What a talent.
Let's look at her chart for progressions. All right, Victoria. When she received the crown of Empress of India. We have a lot we have to look at. For the 10th house, we have to look not only for Jupiter aspects, midheaven aspects, Uranus and Saturn aspects, and of course aspects formed by the Sun. So, let's sort.
And this is when she was given the title of
Empress of India.
a figurative thing, like
No, she truly became the Empress of India.
Did she go?
As did, no, she did not. I think George the Fifth went to India. I think he was the only ruling monarch that ever visited his empire. She's just not in India.
Is it on too?
January to
Oh.
December. You know, we might think that that Sun trine midheaven is a big deal, but guess what?
It's her entire
Oh.
life.
That's her entire life, yes, because her Sun, 2 Gemini, midheaven 2 Aquarius. The midheaven progresses with solar arc, so they're moving forward the same. Midheaven square Neptune. This could be the fact that, is this a dubious title? It was given her by Parliament, probably not by the citizens of India. The Sun square Venus at that time. Well, you know, not such a big deal because Venus always brings gifts. And receiving the crown of India was
Right, but it's a
quite a
little
big
much.
gift, whether it's yours to give or not. Her midheaven is, look at this. Within 2 weeks, her midheaven is in conjunction with Pluto in her chart, Empire. And the Sun was applying to a trine to Pluto. Also, Empire. Extracted a lot of wealth while they were there.
sure, yeah.
But at the
They-
expense of others. I mean, it was
Right.
very coercive, very.
Which empire at any time in history with any culture has been that way.
And it was another, 50 years until the independence of India? 1876 to 1949.
9, yeah,
So,
yeah. Independence and partition came in 1949.
so another,
Yeah, we're looking at 74 years later.
And Raj means the
King. The British monarchy, the British Empire in India was called the Raj. No, the British had, see, prior to her becoming empress and it becoming a political ward of the British Empire, it was actually run by a corporation, the British East India Company.
for quite a
And
while.
there were a lot of abuses done I mean, this was a company that gained the license to operate all commerce in India. But the British East India Company was ready to step out. And again, it was the jewel in the crown. Britain was not about to let go of India, nor were they in 1949, except for being so embarrassed in the court of world opinion.
Charisma of Gandhi.
Because of the charisma of Gandhi, but his ability to galvanize a nation. And again, one of the things in post-World War II that was a real challenge, if everyone had fought to prevent Germany from creating an empire, what role did empire have in the world? And so for the succeeding 2 to 3 decades, Britain slowly gave independence to her colonies in Africa, Canada, and Australia. Went on to become independent, still maintaining membership in the Commonwealth. And India gained independence, and Burma, which was huge. The decision was after we dissuaded Japan and Germany from creating empire.
Surely
What did
the
this?
British Empire wasn't the only other empire left, though, right?
Well,
Was that-
Portugal still had holdings in Angola and Macau, which Portugal also slowly, it was also, I believe, in the late 60s or 70s, I could be wrong, but that Portugal also gave up its pieces of empire. Well, let's take a look. At what time are you thinking?
The time that the Empire State
Well, let's say 1949,
was
26 Gemini to 1 Virgo. I think that was taking place in 45. Let's take a look.
When did it
Was
turn
it
around?
August of 45 that the war ended?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's when the bombs were dropped.
So, any questions on this relationship? Yeah, I mean, individually, they were just such fascinating characters, and the fact that they had the opportunity to work with one another, however brief, it did lead to a lifelong friendship, though he predeceased her by 20 years. Right, because since she didn't have any friends, to lose your one friend would be rather painful. So he was 76 when he died. She lived to age 81.
Were they the same age?
No, he was a good 15 years older than her.
How old was
Yeah, 14 and a half years older than her.
he?
Perhaps since she had lost her father at an early age and had been raised by a, abusive consort to her mother, he may have been also the paternal figure in her life.
Victoria.
Right, you'll see all of his planets are in her 6th house of labor and service.
So his Saturn is there. That could be an authoritarian father figure influence, right? But would we also look for where his son is in her chart?
Correct.
8th house.
Right, it's a degree and 15 minutes apart, so I think this was something that was very powerfully felt by them, that there was an intuitive rapport that took place between the two of them. Also in this case, it's in Sagittarius, and the role of the monarch in England is also to be the head of the Anglican Church. Neither of them were in love with the Church of England. I mean, he was a convert at an early age, but wanted to rid the Anglican service of everything Catholic, which would have been everything. And since Anglicans are more Catholic than Catholic, at least in today's world, and she far more identified with Presbyterianism than with the Anglican Protestantism. And so I think that conjunction in Sagittarius was also that sort of abstract philosophical connection. Yeah. All right. Sorry again about the frustration with the sound for tonight's class and for delaying this. But this is the end, and I thank you all for being here.
Thank you for just harassing me.